On a cold December night in 1968, a young couple drove to a quiet road on the edge of Benicia, California. They were teenagers. 17-year-old David Faraday, 16-year-old Betty Lou Jensen. To the people who knew them, they were ordinary young people at the beginning of their lives. A first date, a winter evening, a parked car on a lonely road. Nothing about that night should have become part of American criminal history. But shortly after 11 p.m., both of them were found dead beside Lake Herman Road. At first, police believed the murders were brutal, random, and possibly local. A terrible crime, but not yet a legend. Nobody standing near that cold roadside understood what had truly begun, because months later, a voice would claim responsibility. Letters would arrive at newspapers. Ciphers would terrify the public. And the killer would give himself a name that still haunts American history. The Zodiac. Before the letters, before the symbol, before the ciphers, before the panic across Northern California, there was only a dark road, a parked car, and two teenagers who never came home. In the late 1960s, Northern California carried two different faces. By day, it looked alive with movement. Suburbs expanded, highways connected growing cities. Young people listened to music, went to school, worked part-time jobs, and gathered in quiet places far from parents and authority. But at night, the same landscape changed. Roads outside town became empty. Fields turned black beneath the winter sky. Headlights disappeared quickly into distance. And certain places became known by teenagers as private spaces. Lovers' lanes, quiet pullouts, roadside areas where young couples could sit alone for a while. Lake Herman Road was one of those places. It ran between Vallejo and Benicia, passing through rural land, open darkness, and isolated stretches where a car could sit unnoticed. To most people, it was just another road. To teenagers, it was a place to be alone. To police later, it became the beginning of a nightmare. David Faraday was a high school student remembered as polite, responsible, and serious. He was not the kind of teenager people expected to find in danger. Betty Lou Jensen was bright, social, and full of energy. Friends described her as warm and outgoing. The evening of December 20th was supposed to be simple. David picked Betty Lou up for what many accounts describe as their first date. They visited friends. They drove through familiar places. Then they eventually ended up on Lake Herman Road. No one knows exactly what they talked about inside the car during those final minutes. No one knows whether they noticed another vehicle approaching. No one knows whether they had even a few seconds to understand what was about to happen. That is part of what makes the first attack so haunting. There was no warning, no known argument, no robbery, no clear motive, just sudden violence in a place that had always felt ordinary. Sometime around 11 p.m., another car appears to have pulled near the couple's vehicle. Investigators later reconstructed the scene from bullet evidence, witness sightings, and the position of the bodies. What they saw suggested speed and control. The attacker approached the parked car. Shots were fired into the vehicle. David may have been forced out or tried to exit. Betty Lou ran. She did not get far. The quiet road became a crime scene within seconds. When the bodies were discovered, the shock spread quickly through the local community. This was not San Francisco. This was not some distant place people could emotionally separate from their own lives. This was near home, a road people recognized, a place teenagers had visited, a place parents now feared. Police arrived at Lake Herman Road and began working through the freezing darkness. Flashlights moved across pavement and gravel. Evidence markers appeared near shell casings. Officers examined the car. They studied the angle of gunfire. They tried to understand why two teenagers had been targeted so suddenly. But from the beginning, the case gave them very little. There was no obvious suspect, no confession, no demand, no message, just two young victims and a silent road. At that stage, nobody knew the murders would later be connected to a larger pattern. Police investigated possible personal motives. They looked into local conflicts. They considered whether someone had followed the couple. They questioned people who knew them. That was normal. Most murders are not committed by mysterious strangers who create legends. Most murders have personal connections. Anger, jealousy, revenge, money, relationships. But this case resisted those explanations. David and Betty Lou did not appear to have enemies capable of something like this. Nothing about their lives explained the brutality of the attack. And that absence made the crime more disturbing, because when a murder has no visible motive, fear spreads differently. People begin imagining the killer as anyone, a stranger, a passing driver, a person living nearby, someone who could return. For the families, the loss was immediate and unbearable. For the community, the fear grew slowly. At first, Lake Herman Road was treated as a horrifying, isolated crime. But months later, that assumption would collapse. The reason the first murders matter so much is not only because they were tragic. It is because they reveal something important about the killer before he became famous, before he wrote letters, before he created a symbol, before he manipulated newspapers. The first attack was quiet, hidden, anonymous, no performance, no theatrical message, no public identity, just violence. That raises one of the deepest questions in the entire Zodiac case. Was Lake Herman Road the beginning, or was it only the first attack authorities could later connect to him? The official Zodiac case includes 5 confirmed murders in the Bay Area between 1968 and 1969, and the FBI has long described the case as involving murders and cryptic communications that terrorize Northern California. The Lake Herman Road killings became the first murders widely attributed to the Zodiac, though the killer's identity remains unknown. But the Zodiac himself would later claim far more victims than investigators could confirm. And that creates a terrifying possibility. The man who killed David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen may not have been beginning. He may have already been practicing, or fantasizing, or waiting for the moment when violence became identity. This is where the Zodiac case becomes different from many other unsolved crimes. The murders were horrific, but the fear that followed came from the killer's need to be seen. He did not simply want to kill. He wanted recognition. He wanted control over the public imagination. He wanted newspapers to print his words. He wanted police to chase his symbols. He wanted ordinary people to feel that he could appear anywhere. But none of that existed yet on Lake Herman Road. That night was the silence before the voice, the darkness before the name, the crime before the myth. In the days after the murders, investigators searched for patterns. They gathered witness timelines. Some motorists had passed along Lake Herman Road that night. Some had seen vehicles parked nearby. Others recalled nothing unusual. Every minute mattered. Every car mattered. Every light in the distance could have been important. But the evidence never formed the complete picture. The killer had arrived, attacked, and disappeared quickly enough to leave behind only fragments. That would become a pattern. The Zodiac case is built on fragments. A surviving witness here, a letter there, a symbol, a cipher, a partial description, a blood-stained piece of clothing, a phone call, a sketch, a suspect who almost fits, but never completely. Lake Herman Road gave investigators the first fragment, and they did not yet know how dangerous that fragment would become. Months passed. The community tried to move forward. The families mourned. Police continued working the case, but without a clear suspect. The investigation slowed. The murders remained unsolved. Then summer arrived. Northern California warmed. The roads filled again with young people, and another couple would soon sit inside another parked car at night. This time one person would survive. This time the killer would make a phone call. And this time, the nightmare would finally begin speaking, because the man who had remained silent after Lake Herman Road was about to step out of the shadows. Not physically, but through fear, through words, through newspapers, through a name. The first murders were not the end of a local tragedy. They were the opening door to one of the most disturbing unsolved cases in American history. A case where the killer did not just take lives, he created a public identity around death. He turned letters into weapons, he turned symbols into fear, and he turned uncertainty into a legend that still survives more than 50 years later. David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen were not characters in a mystery. They were real people, teenagers, loved by families, remembered by friends. Their deaths should never be reduced to the mythology of the man who later claimed them. But history often remembers the killer louder than the victims. That is one of the darkest truths of cases like this. And maybe that is why their names must be spoken first, before the symbol, before the ciphers, before the suspects, before the legend. David Faraday, Betty Lou Jensen, the first confirmed doorway into the Zodiac mystery, but the story was about to become much larger. Because months after the silence of Lake Herman Road, another attack would happen. Another car, another couple, another night. Only this time, someone would live long enough to describe the man who came out of the darkness. And minutes after the attack, a phone would ring inside a police department. A calm voice would claim responsibility, not only for the new attack, but for the murders on Lake Herman Road. In the next episode, the Zodiac strikes again at Blue Rock Springs, and for the first time, the killer begins to speak. This is Echoes of Humanity TV, youtube.com/EchoesofHumanityTV.